Germany's far-right AfD has notched up another local election win. This time, René Statkiewicz won the race to become mayor of Zedenick. That's a town of 13,000 people north of the capital Berlin. It's the first directly elected AfD mayor in the state of Brandenburg and a notable breakthrough for the party. It's worth adding that there were a number of mayoral elections held this week where the AfD was unsuccessful. So this is not a sweeping victory, but it does offer a window into the party's strategy at the local level. The AfD leader, Alice Weidel, says the party's entrenchment in local politics is growing. Nationally, the AfD is leading in the polls, yet it has so far been kept out of power at both the state and federal level. So what does a win like this tell us about the party's strategy? Is this evidence that a bottom-up plan is starting to work? Or are there limits to how far the AfD can go? Professor Kai Arzheimer studies far-right movements and has a close eye on the AfD. He's with me now to discuss this story. Look, anyone following our coverage of the AfD will know that it is especially strong in Eastern Germany. In last year's federal elections, for example, it won almost every constituency outside Berlin. So when we see a result like this, how surprising is that really?
It's not at all surprising. First, it fits into the bigger picture of the AfD being very strong, especially in the eastern states, but also fits into a larger national picture of AfD resurgence and a strategy that aims at becoming a force in local politics, which the AfD hasn't been before.
It's interesting because you talk about this becoming a force in local politics, and speaking to people in the AfD after this, they talked about they admitted in a sense that the result was down in a sense to the unusual circumstances in this particular town. The predecessor had been sick. His predecessor was also sick. So it kind of played into the AfD strategy here. And I just wonder whether when you see incidents like that and events like that, does it show kind of in a sense that maybe the other parties don't take these elections as seriously?
I do think they take these elections very seriously. They say that all politics is local, and in a sense, this is very true. And the AfD was lagging behind in the past because they didn't have forces on the ground, if you wish, in many communities. You know that there are very many municipalities in Germany, and in local politics, the traditional parties, the center-left, the center-right, but also the Liberal Democrats, even the Greens, have played a long game. They have been the relevant players at the local level for decades now, and the AfD felt the need to build such structures from the ground up, and they still struggle in many places. I mean, they have now, I think, 2 mayors, full-time mayors in the east, but in recent months they have lost more than 20 such contests. So it is still the exception to see them succeed in such races.
How important do you think it is for the party that they are seen to win elections like this in terms of the normalization? You talk about they were being unsuccessful in other elections. There is this stigma attached to the party. So is an election like this important as a milestone?
It is certainly something the party focuses on. They are trying to spin this into a national news story. But I think it's also important at the local level because this cordon sanitaire, this firewall, is much more difficult to keep up in local politics, especially if you have an AfD mayor whom you may know from the local sports club, who might be an approachable person that you meet in real life. So if the AfD is playing the long game, it is very important for them to become a normal force in local politics.
And what's interesting as well is earlier this year, a strategy paper was surfaced from the AfD, and the headline of this paper is the AfD wants to conquer the villages, and it's talking about things like reopening closed pubs in these communities, turning them into spaces where the community can get together. And one of the factors that they mentioned was also just about the importance of being present locally, about being embedded and being visible in the community. And I wondered, with your perspective, do you think that maybe other parties have lost that kind of connection with voters, or have the AfD understood how important it is in a way that maybe the other parties have just forgotten?
I don't think the other parties have forgotten how important the local game is. And the AfD is just about to discover how this would fit into their long-term plan of becoming a dominant party in Germany. So I wouldn't put the blame at the doorstep of the other parties. I think this is more an instance of the AfD catching up with other parties, and the fact that in many local communities in the countryside especially, people are moving away, the local infrastructure is crumbling, there is a decline in population. So a sense of being left behind, of losing out is quite widespread. And I think the AfD is trying to make hay from this feeling and to tune into this sense of deprivation in large parts of the countryside.
It does seem to be kind of working, and as you say, in large parts of the countryside. And it reminds me of the writer David Goodhart. You'll know about this. He talks about this divide between the anywheres and the somewheres, and that's between the more mobile, globally oriented voters and those rooted in places who often don't move or who don't leave their hometowns. And I remember listening to one of the senior figures in the AfD citing David Goodhart and saying, we represent those people, the somewheres, the people who feel left behind by economic and cultural change. And I just wonder, is that a way, how true do you think that is? Does that mean that other parties don't represent those groups? Or are we at risk of simplifying what's going on?
Of course, we are at risk of simplifying what's going on. So other parties, especially parties to the center-right, have a much better claim at representing the rural population. So they have extensive networks. They reflect the slightly more conservative values of the countryside. So it's also very easy to fall into a trap and belief into the AfD's rhetoric in this case. Also, I think something that's underestimated at the moment, what also makes the countryside attractive for the AfD, is that they meet less resistance. Property is cheap, people are less organized, civil society is weaker. So the AfD is building so-called centers in many parts of the country, not just because they represent a rural population or claim to represent a rural population, but also because they are more often left alone and left to their own devices in these places.
Does that mean that we should expect the AfD to pick up more election wins at that communal level?
Yes, I expect they will make inroads at the communal level. At the moment, what is working against them, amongst other things, is incumbency advantage. So in many places, you have a mayor from the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats, or even a left or green or liberal mayor. But in the future, there will be more AfD mayors because more often than not, the other parties will not have this advantage, I think.
Obviously, zooming out, we're interested in watching what the AfD is doing on the national picture as well. The surveys suggest that they are the number one party that's in Germany, that voters, especially when you looked at the surveys in recent state elections, the reason why people were voting for the AfD, it was very much clear that this was no longer a protest vote anymore. People believed that the AfD was offering actual solutions to lots of the problems and challenges facing this country. And I wonder whether you think that signals a kind of a change. What do you think? What are the issues that you think are driving that support?
From the data that I have seen, the main driver of AfD support is still backlash against immigration and against Germany being a multicultural society. But I think the AfD is also benefiting from a general sense of malaise, from worries about the economy, from a sense that the national government cannot work together and is not achieving very much. So this is not protest voting in the sense that AfD voters are not convinced by what the party is offering, but they are certainly able to enlarge their base at the moment. This is a development that I find equally dangerous, but also quite fascinating to watch how they manage to broaden their constituency.
When you talked there about this fear of Germany becoming a multicultural country, is that something that is true of AfD voters overall, or is that something that we could say is more pronounced in the rural areas?
It is slightly more pronounced in the rural areas. It is slightly more pronounced in the east, but you also find larger cities in the west, post-industrial cities, where there is unease about immigration and the way the country is developing more generally. So it's not just the countryside against the cities. It's more areas where many people feel left behind versus areas where people are frankly quite happy with the way Germany has developed over the last 30 years or so.
What do you think the answer then for the other parties? What should they take out of some of these findings that you've identified?
Yes, what we know, what doesn't work is trying to steal the immigration multicultural issue from the AfD, because the AfD owns that issue, and also the normal parties, democratic parties, cannot really compete with the AfD when it comes to demands for expelling all foreigners and expelling Germans who look different or have different religion or whatnot. So I think what the other parties should do is talk more about their own issues and developing their own vision for Germany without trying to out AfD the AfD.
You know, the next elections in Germany, national elections, are going to be should be held in 2029, barring any sort of change to government here in Berlin. Do you think it now looks like the AfD is a serious contender for national power? How should we see them?
That very much depends on the other parties. So nationwide, they're currently polling 25, 26, sometimes even 27%. That is still a minority, so they wouldn't be able to form a government on their own. It will very much depend on the Christian Democrats, whether they keep that firewall, cordon sanitaire, in place, whether they dare to not ignore, but dare to develop their own policies without, at every turn and corner, talking about immigration and trying to win back AfD voters. I think if the Christian Democrats focus on their own strengths, then there is no national perspective for the AfD. But we have seen the same pattern in other countries where center-right parties began to work with far-right parties and have sometimes been crowded out by the far-right.
Professor Kai Arzheimer from the Institute of Political Science, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me on the show.